saw the demonstrations across America. I sit on a House Judiciary Committee and very honored that we passed the Justice and Policing Act out of the committee. And then we recently passed the act out of the House floor. It's now before the U.S. Senate, and we urge Senator McConnell and the U.S. Senate to take that bill up for passage. At the same time, we see race infect a lot of other areas of society, and we see it occur, for example, in healthcare. We know that during this pandemic, African Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Pacific Islanders have died at far higher rates than whites. We see racism affect institutions such as education, and even in computer algorithms and over the internet. I myself am a recovering computer science major. And so we're gonna have a wide-ranging discussion tonight. I'm going to also now introduce our two honored guests. We again have USC Dean Pedro Noguera. He has specialized in education as well as how race creeps into education. He's going to talk about that subject. And then Dr. Noble has a focus on how race affects essentially computer algorithms and the internet and searches, and she's been a leader in that field. So we're gonna have a very interesting discussion tonight. And with that, let me open it up and have Dean Noguera give an opening statement, followed by Dr. Noble.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for an opportunity to join you tonight at this town hall on this topic of racial justice. So let me start by just saying that this issue of structural racism is not new. It's rooted in our history, a history of racial oppression, a history of slavery, a history of genocide against Native Americans. And that history didn't just go away when slavery ended, for example. And so in the fall of last year, we released a report called Beyond the Schoolhouse, looking at what was happening with Black children in LA County. And we did it because there had recently been reports showing that amongst all groups, there was really no progress at all for Black children. And we want to know why. What was going on with Black children in LA County, why we would see no progress academically. And what our report focused on, what was happening outside of school was impacting children inside of school. So Black children in LA County, and this matches and mirrors patterns we see across the country, have much higher rates of asthma, much higher rates of food insecurity, much higher rates of homelessness, foster care. On top of that, they're in under-resourced schools. That is, schools that lack counselors, that lack social workers, that lack the ability to address those other needs that kids have, the social and emotional needs that impact learning. So one of the things we've known for a long time is that the disparities we see in educational outcomes mirror other disparities, disparities in health, disparities in life expectancy, disparities in income. And all of this speaks to a structure that perpetuates these patterns of racial inequality. And so if we're going to bring about change, we have to recognize we can't focus on education alone. We have to focus on what's happening outside of school as well in our communities. And when we look at Black communities, if you look at a place like Compton, for example, or South LA, you'll see very few parks. You'll see that the environment itself is toxic, and there are much higher rates of trauma among the children. So we need a different strategy if we're going to address those issues. And sadly, since we don't have leadership at the federal level, that leadership has to come from the state and from local leaders to make sure that we are providing support to children in schools to improve outcomes, because our future as a region and as a society depends on it.
Thank you very much for your comments. And now let me turn to Dr. Noble.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Congressman Lieu, and thank you for your work. I want to first do a little bit of definitional work around structural racism, because I think it's something that a lot of people, quite frankly, don't understand. We're, of course, in a moment where people are pouring out into the streets around this country and around the world demanding racial justice in the case of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others for whom we have not yet seen justice served. And so this is a time in our country where people are really trying to make sense of what's happening. And one of the things that I think is so important when we talk about structural racism is that we're talking about a host of policies and institutions and cultural practices in this country that allow for the inequality to foster in our society. And as Dean Noguera said, these are practices that have been with us since the institution of slavery. These are practices, of course, that are increasingly not just a matter of a lack of or a rollback of civil rights legislation in this country, but also are increasingly, we're seeing inequality increasingly automated through a variety of kinds of technologies that make inequality, in fact, harder to grapple with and harder to intervene upon. And this, of course, is one of the areas of research that I focus on. So I think it's important that we try to figure out where the points of intervention might be in the systems that we are interacting with. And those are systems, of course, that happen at the legislative level. And those are systems that disparately impact us. I can say, for example, that one of the crises of the coronavirus and COVID-19 is we're seeing the disproportionate impact of the disease on African Americans and Latinos. And one of the reasons why is not just because people are African American or Latino, it's because we are in communities that are disproportionately underserved with medical and healthcare resources. We are more likely to be in precarious jobs that don't have employer-based healthcare, for example. We live in a society that doesn't provide necessarily adequate public health infrastructure, as well as educational and other kinds of infrastructure. So these are some of the dimensions of the ways in which structural racism gets defined, enacted, and becomes quite everyday and mundane for the people who are affected by it, for our communities. And I think one of the things that we need to pay significant attention to is the way in which many of the decisions affecting people in our societies are increasingly becoming automated. The predictive technologies, algorithms, and AI are often now being used to help decide how resources are distributed in our society. And these are places that will, these are practices and functions that will bolster structural inequality, and these are important topics for us to talk about tonight. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Noble. So Dean Noguera, I know you've had extensive experience advising education officials across our country. By the way, my wife, Betty, is on the Torrance School Board. And so a question for you is, what specific policies would you suggest to address the structural racism that we see in education?
So the big issues, as I said earlier, in education concern the fact that we focus too narrowly on issues like student achievement and don't focus at all on child development. So we know hungry kids don't do well in school. Well, right now we have a problem with hunger across America, particularly in poor communities, particularly in communities of color. We know that kids who don't have eyeglasses have trouble reading. We don't have a plan to get kids eyeglasses in this country. So some of the problems are basic, they're obvious. The fact that we ignore them is what is troubling. Most other countries, if you were to look at Canada, most other Western European countries, they have comprehensive healthcare systems. Canada enacted a child poverty law in the 1920s that pretty much eliminated child poverty in Canada. So we could learn a lot if we simply followed the example of other countries. And we would see, for example, in Canada, most people can speak 2 languages because they don't think that speaking another language is a problem. In our country, we have many Americans trouble with speaking 1. despite the fact that we have people from many different countries who come with different language and culture. So we have to look at the policies we pursued in education. No Child Left Behind really hurt us because it fixated us on standardized testing and ignored whether or not we were creating conditions in schools that were conducive to teaching and learning, and ignored the basic needs of children. And so what we see throughout the country is wherever poverty is concentrated, schools are failing. The problem is we are more likely to blame the kids or blame their teachers rather than to ask, have we done what it takes to provide the supports those schools need to make sure that kids can thrive?
Thank you for that answer. I'm glad you brought up eyeglasses. I remember having a conversation with the current LAUSD superintendent, and before he was there, he ran a nonprofit that helped give eyeglasses basically to children in low-income school areas. And just that one change alone helped a lot of kids, because all of a sudden they could see. And turns out when you see, you do better in school. And for some of these kids, they didn't even know that they needed glasses. They just thought that's how the world looked. And their parents didn't know to take them to optometrists or had the resources to do so. So it does seem like a lot of what you're saying is we almost need to make these changes at the legislative level, at the state and federal level, that individual school boards can't do this because they don't have the resources and they don't have their ability to make these society-wide changes. Am I understanding you correct? That we basically need to look at everything outside of education and make it better.
That's right. And we've known for a long time, for example, that the preschool, early childhood education is so critical for establishing the foundation for learning in children. We have good research. Oklahoma, 80% of kids in Oklahoma are in high quality preschool, and the research shows those kids have much better outcomes over the course of their lifetime. A local school district, most local school districts by themselves cannot establish universal preschool. You do need legislation from either the state or the federal level to do it. And so we need leadership, and we need leadership to make sure that kids get their eyes examined and kids get enough to eat. Right now, many of our schools are turning our food distribution centers. In LA Unified, they're giving out meals, thousands of meals every day, because our schools are all that we have of a social safety net for children. It should not be up to schools to solve these problems. We need our whole society chip in. We live in a rich country. There's no reason why we should have hungry children in America.
Thank you for that. And I completely agree with everything you said. I'd like to now switch over to Dr. Noble. You're the author of Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Can you explain to folks, first of all, what an algorithm is and how you can have a racism in algorithms?
Sure. So an algorithm is really a set of instructions that you give to a computer in order for it to produce a variety of different kinds of output. So some people describe it as a recipe that you might give to a computer, right, that will help you predict out or create varying sets of results. I wrote a book about algorithms of oppression because for many years, the way in which the country was, quite frankly, rapidly embracing new technologies without really thinking about the consequences of who might be harmed by them seemed to be, again, something we should pause and take a look at, and in fact, even think about legislating around. What we have right now are many different types of predictive analytics. Predictive analytics are basically technologies that take data from the past, right? All the kinds of statistical information and data sets that we develop around a whole host of different kinds of social processes, things that happen, educational data, for example, the kinds of things that Dr. Noguera is talking about, disparate outcomes that have happened in the past, And many of those things are tied to segregation, tied to real estate covenants, tied to racial discrimination, housing discrimination, employment discrimination. All of the kind of data and histories that have happened in the past often are then turned into data sets that train machines in order to predict different kinds of outcomes and where to focus resources. So, for example, in Los Angeles, one of the things that we do is we take all of the historical arrest data from where Los Angeles Police Department has arrested people, and we turn that into a variety of different predictive analytics to determine where LAPD should deploy its resources, where it should put more police officers, and how it should engage with communities where it does policing. Well, one of the challenges then is that if you have a history of over-policing poor communities, over-policing African American and Latino communities, then your predictive analytics using that data from the past is going to reinforce those same kind of practices, if not even more severely, into the future. So that's just one of many, many different kinds of examples of how predictive analytics reinforce the worst, in some cases, practices of the past, encode them and make them opaque, and then kind of spit them back out in our social practices, in our distribution of resources, in ways that are deeply unfair and just really double down on some of the worst practices or most disparate and unfair social practices. These are the kinds of things that I study, and I think they're really important because one of the most profound harms of kind of algorithmic decision-making is that those processes are so opaque. Many times they're black boxed technologies or technologies that are in the private sector that you cannot see, they cannot be audited. It's very difficult to intervene upon them. As my colleague, Kathy O'Neill says in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, you can't take an algorithm to court. You can't prove civil and human rights violations, for example, with AI and algorithms. And yet they are very much implicated in many civil and human rights kinds of decisions that are affecting us. So these are the kinds of things that I think are, again, tied to the distribution of resources in our society. And I think, one of the things that's been really difficult for me as a University of California professor at UCLA is to see that here I am in California, where the epicenter of big technology, quite frankly, has grown for the past 50 years in Silicon Valley. And these are the very companies that don't pay taxes, quite frankly, for the most part, into the system. And those tax dollars are, in fact, the kinds of resources that should support public health, public education, public higher education, public media, and so forth. So there's really also a relationship between these industries and their broader relationship to society too that we need to be thinking about.
I'm part of the Artificial Intelligence Caucus in Congress, and so as one of our platforms is making sure that these algorithms are not opaque, that we actually know what is going on with the algorithms. So my question to you is, why are they kept opaque? Is it a sort of competitive issue, or what's the reason they can't be made less opaque?
Well, there's a couple things. The first thing is these are considered trade secrets in industry. And so this is one of the reasons, for example, when many small business owners approached the Federal Trade Commission, going on a decade or so ago, arguing that something like Google search engine suppressed their ability to be found in a search engine and prioritized large multinational companies and big organizations over them. The FTC at the time ruled that that was Google's proprietary algorithm and business practice, and they were free to practice business in any way they want. Well, the problem here is that most of the public engages with these technologies like they're public goods. But they are, in fact, not public goods. These are private companies that are traded, publicly traded on Wall Street, and their ultimate customer, so to speak, or their loyalties lie to their shareholders and to their customers. And that is not everyday users of these technologies. So I think one of the challenges is that the way in which these are framed as trade secrets. And of course, the other dimension of this is that many of the companies are building on legacy technologies such that it is very difficult even for them to figure out and pinpoint how the bias or how the discrimination works in their own technologies. And I think that we need to think about oversight when we're talking about the deployment of educational and information resources via the internet. And there's no oversight. These are large, for the most part, advertising platforms that are kind of posturing like public libraries or public resources, but in fact are anything but. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need our legislators to understand most certainly. I'll just lastly say that in the case of predictive analytics like recidivism prediction software that many judges, for example, use to determine how they're going to sentence people who come into their courtrooms, or to determine whether people should be released on bail if they're arrested. We know, and there's a lot of data now showing the ways in which these are more likely to predict African Americans into the most harmful kinds of consequences through those types of analytics. We know that there's no regulation over them. And these are software and technologies that really have a life or death kind of consequence for people. So imagine, the kinds of students that Dr. Noguera, for example, is working with in public educational systems who get, for whatever reasons that we understand, to be caught up in juvenile justice systems, and then predictive analytics determine their fate and their future as to whether they will get out or what the course of their futures might be. I mean, these are very dangerous kinds of decisions, and they're quite opaque. When investigative journalists have asked the makers of these technologies about how they work, they have a hard time explaining why they get these disparate outcomes. It's very difficult. And I guess the question is, would we let some chemists go into a strip mall and make some drugs and roll it out in Walgreens and CVS on the weekend? And if people are harmed, say, oh, well, that's just chemistry. But that's actually how the tech industry works, where companies pour out all kinds of analytics and technologies into society. And after the harm is caused, we're trying to legislate with no real federal oversight. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to intervene.
That's a great point. When I was getting my computer science degree, there were these folks that were working on neural networks. That's what they called them at the time. And we always thought they were sort of, a little bit way off in the future, because their view was we're going to get a computer to think like how a human being does. And we thought, nah, it's never going to get there. And essentially about 10 years ago, it started to work. It's now known as essentially deep learning, where basically you feed a computer, let's say, 1 million pictures of cats. And after a while, it figures out what's a cat, what's a dog, what's an elephant, what's a snake. And I remember having this conversation with a USC professor who specialized in facial recognition. And I asked him, I said, well, so how does this deep learning work? And he looked at me and he said, well, at a very basic level, we don't know, which I found really quite troubling. He just knows that if they write the program a certain way and they put in these inputs and have these weights, it ends up getting to the correct result. But they can't exactly tell you how the computer goes from point A eventually to point Z. And that is very troubling, because you could end up with a computer reaching results and you don't know how exactly through artificial intelligence the computer got there. And we do know that in facial recognition right now, the way the software is constituted, it tends to do less well with faces of folks that have darker complexion. And as a result, it's less accurate if they have pictures of African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans. And that could cause huge problems if police departments were to deploy them across America. I'm glad that many of the makers of this software have actually said they're not going to sell them to police departments, at least for a year or more. And so, Dr. Noble, wanted to know what your view is of the current research on facial recognition and whether they should be deployed by police and other agencies at all.
Well, it's interesting because the most important research around the lack of ability to recognize darker skin tones is a really important study called Gender Shades out of MIT with Joy Bowlmini and Timette Gabru, who found that facial recognition technologies, in fact, are least likely to recognize women of color and Black women specifically. It had the least efficacy on our faces. So I think this is a breakthrough research in that it helps us understand the instability and the lack of reliability of the kinds of facial recognition technologies that are being adopted and deployed in all kinds of scenarios, whether it's airports or by law enforcement or landlords who are using it to, in fact, control who can enter their properties. And these things, of course, get beta tested out in low-income communities, in projects and in housing projects, subsidized housing projects in New York and other major cities. And I think this is one of the things where we have to be very diligent, because what we find is that many of these harmful technologies are beta tested on poor people and people of color. And this is one of the reasons why we have to really hone in and focus on that. But you're absolutely right that, you know, if you talk to the state-of-the-art computer scientists, they will tell you they're still trying to figure out, is this table like that table? You know, the stability, again, of these technologies. But, you know, there's a huge kind of snake oil industry of trying to sell these technologies as if they're reliable. And I will tell you, it was shocking to me to see recently the White House a few months ago, after one of the last mass shootings, said that it was going to buy software and technology to try to predict who the next mass shooter might be in the United States. Now, this is categorically impossible to do. This is snake oil. But see, one of the things, even though people who are watching this who might not agree with all of your policies and politics, I will tell you that the database for predicting who the mass shooter will be, guess what? White men in America. And so we might want to think about whether we want these technologies, even people who might think that these conversations about structural racism, you know, don't apply to them or they don't care. These same technologies will ensnare their children. And I think we want to be very thoughtful, again, about whether these things should be made illegal. You know, the moratorium by Microsoft and Amazon, I think, was insufficient. I call that a little bit more of a public relations opportunity. Many of these technologies are sold to third parties that then sell them to law enforcement. They are increasingly ubiquitous. They're not stable across a whole host of different kinds of agencies. And what we probably should be doing is recalling them and calling them illegal until we can figure out whether these are the technologies that we want to, what I think of as kind of over-determine what our futures will be like.
Thank you. So we are here again with Dean Noguera at USC and Dr. Noble at UCLA, talking about structural racism. And Dean Noguera, I'd like to ask you another question. First of all, I know you've written many books, and one of your books was called Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education 60 Years After Brown. And I know that earlier we chatted about how we have to do a lot outside of school to really help improve the child and improve the education system. At the same time, when I was in the state legislature in California under Governor Brown, we did significantly increase education funding to schools that had higher proportions of English only speakers, as well as low-income students and those on free and reduced lunches. And you had earlier mentioned how schools still, for example, lack counselors in many of these low-income areas. Why does that keep happening, even when it looks like California is giving more resources per pupil to a lot of these lower-income school districts? For whatever reason, it looks like they're still not getting enough resources.
So I do want to acknowledge California's made progress. Under Governor Jerry Brown, the state adopted the local control funding formula, which did bring additional resources to high poverty schools. And so that was a step. And California has increased its per pupil spending rate. So we're no longer one of the last in the country. We're now kind of almost in the middle of the pack. But let's face it, California is a rich state. You know, if we were a nation, we would have the fifth, highest GDP in the world. So to say that, we are in the middle of a pack and well beyond states, behind states, several other states, is to say that we have a long way to go. So what we know, for example, with respect to simply advanced placement courses, counselors, science equipment, that many of our schools cannot provide those basic educational opportunities to kids because the resources still aren't there. And those tend to be the schools that serve our poorest kids. So we have a lot of work to do to begin to close some of those gaps in funding. It's ironic, we've said we're committed to closing the achievement gap, but we haven't addressed the gaps in funding that perpetuate those gaps. We also have to make sure that we, again, don't do this on the backs of teachers. California teachers in many of our cities, including Los Angeles, don't earn enough to live in the city and have to have long commutes. The same is true in the Bay Area and other parts of the state. And so, if you really value education, you have to support the people who work in our schools and you have to support the children. And again, progress has been made, but we have a long journey to dig out of this hole that we're in.
Thank you. Now, this pandemic has raised a number of interesting issues, one of which involves the SAT and ACT. Some colleges have said they're no longer going to require them. Some colleges have said they're going to not require them for a year. Some have said 5 years. Have you looked at the issue of SATs and ACTs and whether there's a racism component to those tests?
Yeah, we've known for a long time that what those tests really test for is socioeconomic status. The strongest predictor for how well the kids will do on the test is how much money the family has, the per capita income of the family, household income. When you combine household income with the education level of the parents, you can predict with great consistency how well kids will perform on those tests. So that rather than measuring actual ability or what a child has learned in school, they're measuring a culturally referenced notion of intelligence. And I think what we want to do in this country is use education as a means to help enable people to improve their lives. And those tests, rather than serving to identify talent, really serve as a barrier to opportunity. And that's why several people have said we need to get rid of those tests. And we need to use other ways of assessing a student, looking at not only at their grades, but overall ability, what they can do. Can that student write? We see lots of students, I'm sure Safiya sees this, Professor Noble sees this as well, who get good test scores, but still can't write because writing is not on the test. And they're not really capable of doing independent research. And some of them have trouble getting out of bed because no one's waking them up to go to class. And so, being really prepared for college education takes more than doing well on a SAT exam.
Since you brought up writing, when I was active duty with the Air Force, I was stationed in Guam, and they had a University of Maryland extension, basically facility there, and they asked if I wanted to teach a class, so I did. I taught political science 101, basically. And I remember after the semester, just based on writing skills, I thought, wow, our education system's in trouble in America. And these were folks of military students. Now, these were students of military families, and they were hardworking, they were generally bright, but they just could not write. It was pretty shocking for me to see that.
Well, think about it, to connect with the points that Dr. Noble's been raising. Think about how many Americans are easily manipulated by fake news on social media. because they don't have critical thinking skills. They don't know, they don't realize you can't just believe everything you see on Facebook. You actually have to look at the source. Those are skills you should have gotten in school, so that you're able to distinguish a propaganda from facts and information. So we have a lot of work to do. Most Americans have very, very limited knowledge of the history of this country. That many are shocked to know that the so-called founding fathers, most of them were slave owners. So we have a lot of work to do in this country to provide an education that really does prepare Americans for democracy, which is what we hoped it would do.
I couldn't agree more.
You're absolutely right. Actually, did you have a comment, Dr. Noble?
No, I just want to say I couldn't agree more that, you know, the people on the front lines of really also seeing the effects of the defunding of education are certainly university professors who work so hard, in fact, to try to teach the critical thinking skills to our students. And we haven't also done ourselves a favor by you know, really buying into the idea that everything STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, math is the only way to help America get ahead, so to speak, or help our kids get ahead. Because what they also need is the ability to understand how art can teach them about people and culture and to appreciate difference. They need to understand the humanities and social sciences, what novels, what literature, and critical thinking about those things can do to help you, in fact, be a better computer scientists. In fact, I say this all the time to my own computer science students, that they should be double majoring in some type of humanities or social science field, just so that they can have a context for understanding and making sense of the world. It does you no good to become, for example, an actuarial science major where you're going to, you know, develop models for the insurance industry or for Wall Street, and you don't know anything about the history of the mortgage crisis or the history of the Depression or how recessions get triggered. You know, when the 2008 mortgage crisis hit, that was the largest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States. All of the gains from Reconstruction and civil rights, effectively in terms of economic wealth, effectively wiped out during the mortgage crisis. Now, if you have new students coming into computer science and actuarial science, places where they will go and develop financial models that in fact were the kinds of models used on Wall Street to game the markets and to cheat people out of their homes, and you don't have any understanding of the context of what you are doing, that is incredibly dangerous. And so it's very important that we have a well-rounded kind of educational system, K through higher education, which means, quite frankly, unlike the United States, unlike most of our modern industrial competitors, doesn't even make university affordable to people in the United States. And I think that we really should, this is an opportunity during COVID-19 where everything is different for us to really emerge with a different set of priorities in terms of our legislative funding and the kind of world that we want to live in, quite frankly. And I think there's so many opportunities to, and so many creative and smart people, quite frankly, who want to work on these problems.
I completely agree with you. I had the opportunity to go to a very good high school that had a diverse array of classes. And the most important class I ever took to me was, it was essentially a philosophy class in high school, because for the first time, it made me ask questions like, how do you define success? What makes you happy? Questions that made you sort of think about life and also self-reflect. You may not agree, none of you may agree with me, but I actually think if we had more of those kinds of courses in high school, it would actually lead to some better outcomes, because it makes people start thinking about some larger questions and issues. But this pandemic has also shown another issue, which is distance learning and online learning. And so Dean Noguera, wanted to see if you had any thoughts on, first of all, what you think of online learning versus in-person instruction, and whether, my view is we see, again, race effects from this, because you have folks that, have better Wi-Fi or even have Wi-Fi at all and have better equipment to be able to do online learning. But just want to get your thoughts on that issue as well.
Yeah, there was a front page article today in the LA Times showing that large numbers, thousands of Black and Latino children in LA were not able to participate in learning at all during the pandemic because they don't have internet access, or they're using their cell phones, their parents' cell phones, to do homework. So we have a huge digital divide that exacerbates the inequities we see in education. The fact that we're going to be, many of our districts will be online in the fall, means we should be working with urgency now to make sure that every household has access to the internet, that kids have screen devices to work on. Otherwise, we're going to see these learning losses impact kids for many, many years to come. I'm particularly concerned about kids with learning disabilities, children who are homeless, and younger children generally who need more support from a teacher to learn to read. So we should have been using this summer to move. Some districts have moved on this and gotten screens and hotspots into the hands of kids, but there are lots of people, and not just in urban areas. There are lots of rural areas where there's no internet access. And this is really actually a crucial issue for many families, because if you don't have access to the internet, you don't have access to help when you need it.
So in the House of Representatives, we have done legislation, first of all, in the HEROES Act, that gives a significant amount of money to both K through 12 schools, as well as to higher institutions of learning. In addition, we're trying to make sure we get broadband everywhere, including to rural areas. But this digital divide is a huge problem. And again, we need the U.S. Senate to act with urgency on it. Dr. Noble, question for you about social media. I've seen some articles that show, for example, on YouTube, that if you watch certain videos, it'll sort of suggest other videos to you, and then it starts to send you more and more extreme versions of whatever subject you're seeing. So it might, take someone who might be, for example, a little bit racist and make them very racist after a while. Do you, first of all, agree with that? Or do you have any thoughts about how these algorithms are with social media and whether there's a race component to that as well?
Well, certainly there's good research now that helps us understand the way in which social media works, which is are about one of those of us who've been on the internet for a very long time. I've been on the internet since the late 80s, and we know that the internet has always kind of been about some of the worst kinds of content, but capturing audiences and grooming them toward the more extreme kinds of content is in fact part of the business model of some of these platforms, who have made billions of dollars, in fact, off of this. And I can tell you that even people who are working in these large platforms are fearful and concerned about the way in which their algorithms are indeed grooming people further and further toward more degrading kinds of content, be it racist, sexist, homophobic, extreme, flat earth, conspiracy theories, ideas that suggest that things like science is a hoax, coronavirus research being a hoax, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which that gets put out there. And of course, there's also all kinds of other actors that are participating in these systems. So we have definitive proof from Congress, in fact, and other federal agencies showing the degrees to which foreign actors and others can participate in these systems to destabilize our common sense understandings of how our own country works and the history of our own country. And we saw this, for example, in the weaponization of organizations like Black Lives Matter, or the weaponization of civil rights movements to stoke fear and anxiety among our white American neighbors. The kind of fear mongering that, again, is incredibly profitable to these platforms. We know that there are calls for regulating these platforms because of the kinds of content that move through them, the kinds of propaganda. And of course, when you couple that with those very companies who, again, evade paying taxes, don't put money into the system. I mean, one of the things I tell legislators all the time is it's important to regulate some of these companies, but you cannot regulate on one hand and then simultaneously defund every public, democratic, institutional counterweight. And those are public schools, public universities, libraries, public media. This is very important because that's the place where people develop the critical literacies that they need to be able to be smart about their engagements in these spaces. But also at the same time, we really need to ask ourselves, is the collapse of democracy the price that we're willing to pay for many of these big platforms to keep making money, printing money off of the collapse of democracy, printing money off of racist propaganda? I don't think it's worth it, quite frankly. And that doesn't mean that we can't have free speech. But we also have to understand that in many cases, much of this speech is not even connected to real people. And also, some speech silences other people from speaking. And in places like Germany and France, other modern democracies, they really put a balance in place between individual and broader kind of democratic civic values. And I think those are things we should absolutely be thinking about.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. Dr. Noguera, another question we got from Facebook has to do with, is there a race component to access to mental health counselors and other counselors? First question is there a difference between the two? Are they generally the same person? And second, do you think there's enough of these counselors?
So there's absolutely a difference in terms of access to mental health services. I'm a New Yorker originally, and a couple years ago, New York Times presented a map of New York City, and it showed where therapists were located. And it turns out they're all located in the wealthiest communities of New York. Almost none in the Bronx, almost none in Queens. It's not because they don't have mental health needs there, it's because you have to pay. And sometimes many of the providers aren't even covered by health insurance. So there's a critical need. But particularly in schools, even before the pandemic, we were seeing a surge in the number of young people who are experiencing mental health crises, from depression and anxiety to suicide, rising across the country, including, and this should be important for your listeners out there, including amongst affluent, high-achieving kids who had some of the highest rates, and part because of the pressure they feel to be successful. We can only imagine now, because there's also data showing that calls for help have increased during the pandemic, that when schools reopen, we're going to see an increase in the number of kids who are experiencing mental health crises and needs. We have to make sure that there are trained professionals who can work with schools to provide those services. Teachers should not be expected to provide services they were not trained to provide. We need actual social workers, actual counselors in our schools doing that work. The typical high school has a 500-to-1 ratio. That means counselors are not able to counsel with those kind of numbers. They barely have time to meet the kids.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera. We need to work on that, absolutely. The last question I'm going to have today. Dr. Noble, you had done an interesting study when people did a search for Black girls and Asian girls. Can you tell us what you found in that study?
Sure. So I was looking at Google search in particular, mostly because Google is a resource that everybody uses every single day. Do you know? I mean, people who are online at least. Google is really our broker or our window into the internet for a lot of people. People use it like a fact checker. Even if they know not to trust something in social media, they immediately go and do a Google search to see if it's legitimate or not. And so I was thinking about years ago, in fact, how does Google represent people and communities, especially ethnic minority communities in the United States? And so I collected a lot of searches on a lot of different identities. One of the things that I found overwhelmingly is that when back in, a decade ago, when I was doing these searches, and kind of up even through new study that'll be a new investigative study that'll be following up on that soon. When you did searches on Black girls, Latina girls, and Asian girls, you were almost overwhelmingly met with pornography on the first page of search results. And I wrote about that for many years. That was the case. And, of course, asking the question, how is it that girls, which in fact it's women, because all of these porn sites are allegedly women 18 years and older who are represented there. So at a fundamental level, women get coded and named as girls on the internet, and I thought that was interesting. But more importantly, you didn't have to add the word sex. You didn't have to add the word porn or any kind of modifier like that or signal like that. Black girls, Latina girls, and Asian girls were synonymous with porn. That is actually what our identities meant in a search engine. And of course, over the years, as I've been doing a lot of talking and speaking and writing about that, Google has really pushed down a lot of the pornographic representations for Black girls. Asian girls and Latina girls still often are represented in sexually objectifying ways. And I think that, again, these are dangerous kinds of representations, because not only are girls of color should not be going into spaces like a search engine and looking on their own identities and seeing themselves reflected back in these ways. I mean, just what must it feel like to be 14 and go and see that not only do you see that this is how Google represents you, but the whole world, in the United States at least, who's using and doing these searches also is seeing you that way. So I think what happens in these spaces is really important. And one of the things that I call for is an intervention. And of course, there are many, many different kinds of disinformation and misinformation results that are in Google to this day. One of the things that I say is, we cannot rely on these big commercial advertising platforms like they are truth tellers. We need more complex types of educational, pathways. We need public interest search engines. We have these rich national treasures. We have the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian. We have so many cultural heritage and important libraries, national and public libraries and academic libraries. We have so much knowledge and knowledge professionals, quite frankly, who should be designing public interest search engines that are more reliable, that are curated, not to make a buck off the backs of us through kind of exploitive content, but instead to really help us bolster our educational systems. So again, so many different kinds of opportunities before us, but it's really important to look at these things we think we trust and that we think are reliable, when I think in many ways they are not.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Noble and Dr. Noguera for being on this amazing town hall today. I really learned a lot from both of you. Hopefully people watching learned a lot as well. And I'll give each of you the opportunity to make some brief closing comments, and then I will close. So Dean Noguera, if you want to go first with some brief closing remarks.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Congressman, for inviting me and for this, I think, important discussion, because the issue of racial justice is not a new issue. It's been with us since the founding of this country, since before, and it is an issue that's been neglected You know, it is so impressive to see a movement for racial justice that swept the country so quickly following the murders that we've seen on vivid display of George Floyd and others. But there's so much work to do, because it's not simply just changing the way policing is done in Black communities. It's the healthcare system, it's housing, it's access to basic resources we need to live. Think about the Flint water crisis and the number of people who, and children who experience contamination in the water they drink. So we have a lot of work to do, but as Dr. Noble has said, we live in a rich country. You know, Jeff Bezos has made more money during this pandemic than anyone in the world. The problem we face is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people. And so the work we have to do, the work people that we elect like yourself, is to make sure that there's fair distribution of that wealth, there's fair taxation, and that all Americans, all people in this country have a chance to experience the wealth of this country and the opportunity to pursue a better life. Education is part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing.
Thank you for those words, Dean Noguera. And Dr. Noble, if you want to close us out.
Sure. I just want to say thank you again. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel with you, Congressman Lieu and Dean Noguera. And these conversations are just the beginning. You know, they're not the end. Dean Noguera is right. These struggles for racial justice in the United States are hundreds of years old. And we want to remember too, you know, the value of studying history is to remember that when the civil rights movement was happening, you know, many people look back now and they say, I was there, I supported Dr. King, I was part of the movement. But, you know, indeed, it was very, very few people. People called Dr. King a communist. They called him a radical. He was on the FBI's most wanted list. Let's not have a revisionist picture of what it takes to make change and to bring about equality in our society. And let's not be faint of heart in our commitments to civil rights and to human rights in this world. We have so much opportunity, and really the lawmakers are incredibly important. You know, it will be Mayor Garcetti, it will be our city council who could make the decisions to defund the police, for example, and refund education, LA Unified School District, to refund county health services and all of the attendant things that we need. I mean, it's about the distribution of resources and then holding those accountable. I mean, I do see the tech sector has been the sector that has made the most money off the pandemic. And again, these are companies that don't pay, you know, they use our post office, they use our roads, they skim the cream of the crop of the best students off of places like USC and UCLA, and then they turn around and give back almost nothing into the coffers. So, you know, we have an opportunity again to be forthright and imaginative in making and remaking the societies that we want to live in. And I think when we center the most vulnerable in our society, we center children, people experiencing homelessness, people with mental health crises, people who would be abandoned if it weren't for our collective care. When we center them in our policies and in our thinking about people who are oppressed and discriminated against, we make for a better society that's really actually better for everyone. So I'm pleased to have an opportunity to share my work with you, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Dr. Noble and Dean Noguera, for participating, and thank you all for watching. Have a good evening.